Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Eric H. Holder Jr. Initiative for Civil and Political Rights and our panel on the American Voting Rights Project on 30 Days of Mixed Government. Now, there was genuinely no pun intended when we came up with the title about mixed government, but it's clear to say that we've been served with a lot of material to talk about in these 30 days. Of course, as time changed, it turned out that there was another event that was scheduled for this evening, an after party, which I'm sure you all tune into after we've had our substantive discussion about the future of American democracy with the State of the Union address tonight, which wasn't originally planned that way, but it turned out that they piggybacked on our discussion. And of course, the response by the 2018 gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams of Georgia, and the Spanish language response by California Attorney General, former U.S. Representative Javier Becerra. Now, the topic of our panel tonight is what are the most significant developments in the first 30 days of the new Congress, and what do we expect that this will shape the way that our elected representatives in the House, in the Senate, and our president will govern in the next 2 years in the run-up to the 2020 election. Now, we're very fortunate this evening to have 5 of the nation's leading experts on these questions with us, and I'm really delighted to welcome them. First, I'd like to welcome back home Attorney General Eric Holder, the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, who, as you know, served from 2009 to 2015 for President Barack Obama, and he was the 3rd longest serving Attorney General in the country. When you add that tenure as Attorney General to his long-standing public service, he was in public service for 30 years now under Presidents Obama, Clinton, and Reagan, and of course, as you know, class of 73, Columbia College, and class of 76 for Columbia Law School. So we're really delighted to have you back, okay, General Holder. Next, we'll hear from Susan Del Percio, who's a political strategist and a crisis communication expert. She's also an MSNBC political analyst, a columnist for Aussie Media, and accredited consultant for the award-winning HBO show, The Newsroom. She has served as special advisor to Governor Andrew Cuomo from 2014 to 15, and as deputy commissioner in the Giuliani administration from 95 to 2001, before she founded her firm in 2001 on crisis communication. After her, we'll hear from the Honorable Donna F. Edwards, who is the former Congresswoman representing Maryland's 4th congressional district, and the first African-American woman elected to represent Maryland in the United States Congress. She served for 5 terms, and before that, as a nonprofit executive, Congressman Edwards co-founded and led the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and she spearheaded the effort to pass the Violence Against Women's Act. After Congresswoman Edwards, we'll hear from the Honorable Steve Israel, who's a former congressman representing New York's 3rd congressional district. In his presentation, I want to emphasize that he was left unindicted and undefeated, right?
It's a triumph to leave Congress unindicted and undefeated.
Just for the record, I wasn't indicted either.
I wasn't by implication. It was just it's a lovely piece in your official bio. He left the House to pursue a career as a writer and spent 16 years in Congress. He's the author of 2 critically acclaimed books. They're both satires of Washington, the first one, and the last one is called Big Guns, and it skewers the gun lobby. And his first novel is The Global War on Morris, which came out in 2015. And if I understand correctly, Congressman, it's just been announced that you'll be the incoming director of the new Cornell University Institute for Politics and Global Affairs. And then I'm really thrilled to welcome my colleague and friend, Professor Gregory Juarow, who's professor of political science here at Columbia University. Many of you know him, many of you study with him. He's our resident expert in American politics, especially Congress, elections, campaign finance, judicial politics, political economy, and also political methodology. He's the author of several books, including Legislative Entrepreneurship in the U.S. House of Representatives, and another book, Filibuster, Obstruction and Lawmaking in the United States Senate, with Eric Schickler. And that last one is a historical analysis of the causes and consequences of filibusters. And he's published widely in top political science journals, and received many awards and fellowships. So it's a real pleasure to have you here to kind of correct us also and kind of give us the kind of structure that we need to understand everything. So we're delighted to have you all here tonight. And I know I'm at the edge of my seat, and I look forward to hearing what you think about these first 30 days of mixed government. And I thought we'd start with you, General Holder.
Okay, thank you, Bernard. I want to welcome everybody here for what is our first of the year, to be followed by others. So enjoy this evening and then come back for the events that will follow. I want to thank all of our participants for joining us this evening. From my perspective, thinking about these first 30 days, one of the questions I actually wanted to put to the members of Congress and to Susan, oversight seems to be something that I would expect of this new House of Representatives. And one of the questions I have is, why is it taking so long? I mean, the election, they happened in November, they got sworn in, I guess, in early January. I haven't seen any hearings, I haven't seen any subpoenas flying and all of this stuff, and I keep, it was already in February. So that's just a question that I would put to you all. But in terms of significant things in this mixed government, I think the introduction of H.R. 1 in the House is really a significant thing. Democrats coming forward with a slate of proposals all put together that really are focused around the notion of good government. I think matters a great deal. I actually kind of wrote down some of the provisions of it so I don't miss anything, but just to give you a sense of what they are trying to do with regard to H.R. 1. Public financing of campaigns, making donors public so you won't have the ability to donate money without your name being revealed, making the Federal Elections Commission have 5 members instead of 4 so that it actually would function. Now there's always deadlocked at 2-2. Making a requirement that if you want to run for president or vice president, you have to submit 10 years of your tax returns. That's become something people have talked about. Automatic voter registration, election day, make that a holiday so that people can vote. End gerrymandering, no voter roll purges. This is not something likely to be passed by the Senate. In fact, Mitch McConnell has described this as an attempt at a power grab. And I look at these things, and it seems to me, well, it's kind of a power grab by the people. And I'm a partisan Democrat, but that's what it would seem like to me. So I think it's an important statement by this new House majority that this is something that they, I think, believe in both substantively and think that this is good politically, to be identified with these kinds of measures and then to force the other side to respond in the way that McConnell has had to. So I think oversight and H.R. 1 are the things that I think are potentially, at least at this point, the most interesting part of the first, 5 weeks of our divided government. Susan?
Thank you.
Well,
Susan Percio.
looking at through a political lens more than an elective office, I find one of the most surprising things and significant developments, I'm going to make it about me for a minute, is that I support Nancy Pelosi as being Speaker, as a Republican. And just how many other Republicans feel that way, going to the General's point about oversight, about responsible government. And I think that we are going to see, those hearings take place. I think politically they're trying to show some restraint, which is good. I also think the Republicans in the Senate are going against the president for the first time Maybe part survival, but maybe part they're finally getting a backbone, which is really important because in a country where the legislative branch does not do their job, we're in dire straits. And I think we're starting to see the beginnings of the House and the Senate, divided government, working together. Of course, the biggest problem is we have a president who never understood how government worked to begin with and just thought, and I say this and it's kind of funny, but it's really true, and that he thought he could just lead and say, I am president, so let's have at it. And that wasn't the case. But one of the things I found so disappointing was how our legislative leaders, both Republicans at the time, were there to fall in line, especially, I would say, when the Speaker Ryan allowed Nunes to put out that confidential intel memo. That was the day I was done with Speaker Ryan. But I think that we really do need to look at the significant changes that in even the first 30 days, people are looking at government a little more responsibly, and their hopes are at least rekindled for it. As far as H.R. 1 goes, what I find interesting is that's not what the Democrats were elected on in this wave midterm election. So I find it interesting that they put out a political message versus something perhaps on health care, which I think was in fact why they were elected. And I think politically they do have to be just a little careful how fast they get information. Although, frankly, on the Republican side, on the Intel Committee, they were holding up names, appointing names to the committee, so the Republicans were. So that slowed down things. But I think the 30 days, especially under a shutdown, really, I think, woke up a lot of people who knew they couldn't just stay in their corners anymore and needed to get something done.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you. Well, so I think, sort of playing off of my colleagues here on the panel, I want to step back to actually day one, because what I thought was interesting that we never pay attention to are kind of process questions. And the Democrats passed a rules package that no one ever pays any attention to. But it had some significant reforms having to do with congressional ethics. Recall the sexual harassment and other scandals that broke during 2018. And the rules package actually contained some clamps on behavior for members of Congress, paying settlements out of their own pockets instead of having the taxpayers foot those bills. And I think that those were ways of sending a message that this was going to be a different kind of Congress, in addition to the rules that Congress places on itself. But Democrats were also saying that this election was about reform and oversight, and that's why I think you got H.R. 1. And again, I think it's really important that there be marker bills to say what Democrats stand for, so that over the course of the election cycle, that it's really clear. And when voters show up in 2020, they say, well, that's what they'd do if they were elected to office. And I think that we're going to see a number of those things in addition to real legislating that's going on during this Congress. I also think there's an important message that's sent about oversight. It's not a surprise to me, quite frankly, that things have taken some time getting started. On some committees, like the intelligence committees, there was intentional, not appointing members to kind of monkey with the process. But in other ways, it was pretty routine getting the Congress organized, getting committees organized, figuring out what the agenda is going to be. And I suspect that over the next 30 to 60 days, there is actually going to be a robust environment of investigation and oversight. And not all of it is going to involve subpoenas, but it's going to be getting back to the traditional role of oversight that every committee in the Congress should be playing, and that really hasn't been done at all during these last couple of years. And I think that there was a message sent to the President of the United States about the three branches of government and the responsibility of the legislative branch to legislate and to provide oversight, and that's something that he hasn't been used to, and I think it is because he doesn't appear to know that much about how governing works, but I also think it's because he had a group of complicit legislators on the Republican side who had decided early on that they weren't going to play their traditional role. And so I think this last 30 days has been interesting to get the ball rolling, but the real fire is going to be over the next 60 days.
Thank you. Congressman Israel.
Thanks very much. Honored to be here, especially with somebody who I consider to be one of the finest attorneys general that the United States ever had. So thank you for everything that you have done, Attorney General Holder. And get to be with my sister, Donna Edwards. We served together for many years. I think three things really struck me. Three, I think, important trends in the first 30 days. Two are self-evident. One is a little inside baseball. Number one, obviously, the election of Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House, something that everybody doubted except for Nancy Pelosi. I was, as Donna knows, I was the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee for 4 years. I sat with her for hours on end every day. Eric knows this, Donna knows this, every panelist knows this. There is nobody who knows how to count votes better than Nancy Pelosi. It is why the Affordable Care Act was passed in the House of Representatives. It is why she's the Speaker of the House. Second thing was the impact of the shutdown. Obviously, the shutdown, a major event in the first 30 days. And it had two impacts, I think. The first impact, clearly, it established who was in charge. And Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats and Senate Democrats clearly established their primacy in that fight. Donald Trump made a strategic error. I never pretended to be the smartest member of Congress, although the competition wasn't really that stiff, present company accepted. But I know my military history. You never fight a battle on your opponent's high ground. Donald Trump tried to fight this battle on the Democrats' high ground. He lost. So the Democrats established their primacy. But the flip side of that, the consequence of that, is that the Democrats lost their narrative. They wanted to come out with a bill to reduce prescription drug prices. They wanted to do something on student debt. They wanted to do H.R. 1. They wanted to do infrastructure. They were denied that narrative because the shutdown sucked all the oxygen out. And the third development, I think, the third major trend would be how Pelosi has handled those committee assignments that Donna alluded to. When you look at what she's done, you know, there's tension, supposed tension between the progressives and the moderates. The Democratic caucus expanded by 40 seats. Most of those seats were won in right-of-center districts. And so you've got this tension between the progressives and the blue dogs and the moderates. And if you take a look at how she has distributed the population across committee assignments, it's fascinating. So there is balance everywhere. In particular, she has empowered the next generation. I was shocked when I saw how many new members of Congress are on Intel, on Ways and Means, on financial services, AOC given a seat on financial services. So I think that was very important. And I'll just say one other thing. Every midterm election is fundamentally a referendum on the president. And this gets to the point that Attorney General Holder led with. This midterm election, 2018, was about oversight. People voted for checks and balances. This was a massive referendum on President Trump. The American people spoke. They said they wanted a Congress that would impose checks and balances, that would have hearings, that would hold him accountable. And the first 30 days has accentuated that. And I agree with Donna that the next 30 to 60, you're going to see far more intense hearings and oversight. However, the Democrats can't lose sight of the fact that, and this is my final point, while they're pursuing this oversight, while they're doing these investigations, still, for most Americans, in most of those swing districts, it's about my wage stagnation, it's about my drug prices, it's about the fact that my kids can't afford to go to college, it's those bread and butter issues. And if Democrats don't attend to those issues, I believe their majority will be challenged significantly in 2020.
Thank you, Congressman Israel. Professor Wawro.
Thank you. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Professor Harcourt and Attorney General Holder for inviting me to be part of this panel. Thank my colleagues for being here. So if In the 2016 presidential election, about 78,000 voters spread across Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin had voted for Hillary Clinton instead of Donald Trump. This panel tonight would most likely be discussing how President Clinton, after the results of the 2018 midterms, will be dealing with an increased Republican majority in the House of Representatives and, perhaps more importantly, a filibuster-proof majority, Republican majority in the Senate. But as we all know, that's not how things worked out. My point is that we would be asking very similar questions about how the U.S. government will function under divided partisan control and what this means for the 2020 elections. In some sense, I think after the 2018 midterms, divided government was an inevitability. Recent elections seem to be largely about corrections, where voters in the current election vote against, or at least don't vote for, what they voted for in the last election. And so one way to think about the next 2 years of mixed government or divided government is how will the parties position themselves to shape and prepare for what correction might happen in the 2020 elections? Will the correction of the 2018 midterms continue? If so, that's good for Democrats. But Democrats need to be careful about going too far with policy proposals that they put forward but stand little to no chance of enactment. Such proposals would make them susceptible to being painted as too extreme and thereby reduce the appeal for the electorate of continuing what I refer to as the 2018 midterm correction. They also need to be careful about going too far with investigations of the Trump administration. Generally, one way we could summarize this is to say that the Democrats need to avoid making the mistakes that Republicans made that led to the resurgence of Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, in the mid-1990s. So the first 30 days, so that's on the Democratic side, the first 30 days of the 116th Congress may provide clues about the Republicans' strategic plan for divided government. We're starting to see more pushback from top Republicans on the shutdown, on the border wall, on foreign policy, and the Republicans as a party need to figure out what to do with a mercurial president whose actions are predictable only in that they cater to his base. The dilemma that Republicans face is that while it's pretty clear that they can't win the White House and control of Congress without Trump's base, it's not clear that they can win by pursuing an agenda that is tailored mainly to please them. So governing under divided control requires compromise, and the way the first 2 years of the Trump administration have played out, especially with respect to the government shutdown, given that my sense is that many key Republicans in the Senate have lost faith that Trump is a reliable negotiating partner. And so while the Republicans under unified control did not achieve much, they did achieve landmark tax reform and likely conservative control of the Supreme Court for the foreseeable future. These are arguably their two most important governing priorities. But given the historically low approval ratings of Donald Trump and his unpredictability, my prediction would be that Republican members of the House and the Senate more and more will kick into self-preservation mode, and that means distancing themselves more and more from Donald Trump. As these Republicans' defections increase, this is going to make it harder, perhaps impossible, for the party to put forward a coherent case through policy action that the 2018 midterm correction should not continue into 2020. This doesn't bode well for the capacity of the government to address the pressing problems that the country faces on both domestic and international fronts.
Thank you so much, Professor. So,
And on that up note,
we'll end on an up note, I think, but we'll get there maybe. So there were three topics that I heard as you were reacting that I want to start with. The first one has to do with Nancy Pelosi. And so I was interested, Susan, why you said, as a Republican, I support Nancy Pelosi, and then, of course, Congressman Israel also thought that was one of the most kind of significant movements here. So why don't we start there? Why did you say that?
I said that because, first of all, I put myself as an American before being a Republican. And I believe that we needed responsible governance. And Nancy Pelosi has a proven record, and I trust her to work to continue moving our country forward. Even if I don't agree with the principles, I believe that as a speaker, she would bring more responsibility to the role, and she would bring some moderation, perhaps. And I think the committee appointments are a great point. Because let's not forget, the Democrats, yes, they came in 40 new members in swing districts. But you had 24 new members on the Democratic side who were either in tough primaries or no primaries. And it was those tough primaries, which is even a smaller percent, that are very loud right now. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you also need to balance it, because this is about governance. This isn't about winning or losing. We've become so partisan that our partisan politics have gone from disagreeing on policy to just hating the other person. And that should not exist. And I have faith in Nancy Pelosi, in part for the reason that I think she will continue to move the ball forward. She did so. Mitch McConnell knew that he could rely on her as a partner to end this shutdown, and that's exactly what happened. Mitch McConnell had to let it play out with the president for a certain amount of time, but he knew he had a negotiating partner with Nancy Pelosi. And the other thing is going to the issue of compromise. When I started out in this business 30 years, compromise was fine. We've always had some form of divided government. It's been the exception when we've had all branches of the same party. And it used to be, oh, that's when we get things done. That's when we can tackle the hard problems. My big concern is not Mitch McConnell on solving this current shutdown problem, or even some of the bigger issues. It's that you have a president that you cannot negotiate with because you cannot trust him keeping his word. And up to the last second, even his own people don't know where he is. So I'm happy that we have someone who's not just going to bow to the president and stand up for what needs to be done, even if I don't agree with the policy.
But make things happen, is what you're saying. Make things happen.
Yes, but responsible. Mm-hmm. And oversight's a key thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, oversight, I can't wait to see what happens with HUD. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, there's all intel and that's all important, but wait till we see what happens in the HUD investigation. Mm-hmm. From what I've heard, it's been a horror. It's beyond a mess. So that's another example.
Right, yeah. And the second thing was oversight, so we'll get right to that point. But Steve, you've been nodding your head a lot.
I completely agree with Susan. Let me just give you some very quick examples of, and this may be a lecture in your class, of a speaker's responsibility to govern. The Speaker of the House has a political portfolio, but ultimately the highest responsibility is to govern. Remember, in October 2008, the economy is imploding. We weren't sure we were going to have an economy. On a Friday, I remember, you may have been on this conference call, remember that Sunday conference call where the Secretary of Treasury was saying, today is Sunday, we're not sure, quote, we will have an economy on Wednesday. And they were trying to get us to support the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP. This is under a Republican president, Republican Treasury Secretary. And President George W. Bush had to call the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and say, I don't have enough Republicans who will support the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Can you scrounge enough Democrats to get us to 218? Now, the initial bill was defeated. That's when she realized that the president wasn't kidding. It wasn't a bluff. The Republicans bailed on their own president and bailed on the economy. So what happened? Pelosi provided the votes. She scrounged up enough Democratic votes to give not George Bush a victory, but to keep the economy functioning. And then think about all those shutdowns we witnessed over the past several years. In each one of those occasions, it was either Speaker of the House Boehner or Speaker of the House Ryan who called Nancy Pelosi as the Democratic leader and said, I can't stop my people from shutting down the government. Do you have enough votes to get it reopened? And her sentence was always this, Mr. Speaker, X plus Y equals 218. You're the X, I'll give you the Y, we'll get to 218. That's what you need in a Speaker of the House, and I believe that's the function that she's going to continue to perform. Mm-hmm. Paid for and authorized by Nancy Pelosi for Speaker of the House.
All right, so the other big issue here are the investigations and the oversight, and Congresswoman Edwards, you raised that, and and General Holder, you raised that as well, and we've already kind of touched into it. There was a recent New York Times editorial by the board 3 or 4 days ago that was talking about the dangers of or navigating this space properly so that it's not so that there isn't kind of reaction against the House Democrats for the 2020. And of course, a big question is how it might interfere or not with the Mueller investigation, right? So, so how is it? Let's start with you, Congresswoman Edwards. How is it exactly that you negotiate this proper space of oversight without causing the blowback that is possible, right? And then we'll turn to how to avoid the complications with the Mueller.
It's interesting. I mean, remember towards the end of the year in 2018 and over the last 30 days, there have been a couple of occasions where the Mueller investigation, or maybe it was the Cohen investigation, suggested that there was some there. And there began to be calls for impeachment proceedings among some rank and file Democrats. And Nancy Pelosi actually tamped those out. And in some ways, I actually think that the Howard Stone indictment a couple of days ago gave her the breathing room with some of those members of the caucus to say, you know, we should go through we should wait for the Mueller investigation. We should go through our investigative process, and that, I think, gave her a lot of breathing room with some members of the caucus. And I think that, I mean, clearly she's managing, the Speaker is managing the chairman of these committees in terms of what it is that they're going to investigate, how they're going to divide the work, and you can see that. And let's think about the key chairman that we're talking about. Adam Schiff for Intelligence, Elijah Cummings and Oversight and Government Oversight. What is it? Oversight and Government Reform. I always get that confused. And Jerry Nadler on Judiciary. And these are gentlemen who are actually quite measured and smart and deliberate. And it's really clear to me that those investigations are not going to overlap each other, that there will be coordination among them. We can see that already. And that Democrats will tend to be careful in terms of how they move forward on investigations. And the other piece of this is getting all those other committees working so that some members have some stuff to do. They have homework to do within their committees. Maybe some of them are working on moving an infrastructure bill forward and other matters of legislation that are going to be important for delivering for Democrats, and that will keep them plenty busy.
And you were starting to mention something about the HUD investigation. What's going on there, and what do you see?
Well, I mean, first of all, there's been a lot of both rulemaking and decisions coming out of HUD that really go to the question of whether or not we really have both an affordable housing policy, what HUD is doing to housing. And internally, all of the investigations, all of the questions that are being raised about where contracts are going. I mean, it is a hot mess within HUD, and we actually haven't even paid any real attention to it. It hasn't been because it hasn't been on the front pages.
And just to add to that, plus we talk about oversight, Ben Carson has not been around. Right. As Secretary of HUD. He has literally not been there. He took all of almost last summer off. And the people that are there, they're first of all...
That's a lot of executive time.
That's a lot of executive time. At least we know he would actually do more than watch TV.
They've also had a significant number of senior retirements within the civil service at HUD as well. And there just are not people to do the job.
That's right.
You know, it's interesting because I think that, you know, we do have to kind of thread that needle, but there is the need for oversight in so many different areas that I almost get a little concerned that if Democrats do what I think is appropriate, which is to look at HUD and look at what's going on at the EPA, you know, there's going to be so much going on that people are not going to be able to kind of follow all of the things that are happening. And yet I think it needs to be done in terms of good governance, to put a check on and potentially stop some things that are bad from happening. But you also don't want to get in a situation that we faced in the Obama administration, where the oversight really got a little out of control. You think about Benghazi, you think about IRS. I had to deal with Fast and Furious. I mean, I came up and testified like 8 times on Fast and Furious, only to have an IG report say I didn't do anything wrong. Just everybody note that. Unindicted. And so you want to make sure that you're doing this in an appropriate way, but at the same, and you're not going, you're not going too far. With regard to the Mueller investigation, I think one of the things, and I'd be interested to hear what Susan and members of Congress say. If you look back in history, during the Watergate era, those committees did not wait for Archibald Cox or for Leon Jaworski to finish a report before they started their investigatory hearings. Now, you certainly have to coordinate with Bob Mueller to make sure you're not granting somebody immunity that might be a target of his investigation. You need to work those things through. But I think the notion of just waiting for the Mueller report, such as that might be, which might never be released. I mean, it's entirely possible that Attorney General Barr could appropriately say, I might not agree with this, but he could appropriately say, the tradition of the Justice Department is you do an investigation. If you're not going to indict anybody, you don't issue a report and say, I'm not indicting Eric because. No, if you're not going to indict anybody, that's the end of it. So the Mueller report concludes that there might have been inappropriate conduct or something like that, but nothing that anybody needs to be indicted for. Barr could say, I'm going to hold on to that report. I'm going to summarize it in some way and not share with Congress necessary details. So I think that Congress needs to start the process. Again, it doesn't have to be, I'm not talking about impeachment proceedings. I'm talking about investigations in the way that Congress has done appropriately when Congress has been at its best.
But isn't the real concern there that you would be making an error somehow, calling somebody who they're working on for a different information?
You can coordinate.
Well,
I mean, we did that all the time.
Yeah, and let's not forget, those investigations have been ongoing. It's just in the House they've been deemed, I'll say to be kind, weak, whereas at least in the Senate, the Intel Committee has been working in a much more bipartisan way, which is typical. So I think they have been coordinating with Mueller. I think the thing that's getting kind of wrapped around the initial Mueller probe is that there's so many other things that this probe is turning out that we don't know if it's Michael Cohen in NY, Southern District, or if it's another Manafort case. There's so many other things out there that don't seem to have any oversight by Congress, which I'm not necessarily sure they need to.
Let me just add a horribly banal break to this, and that is that it actually takes time to go from a minority staff on the Intel Committee to a majority staff, from a minority staff on oversight and government reform to a majority. I was with Adam Schiff over the weekend, and he was saying that the sheer amount of rebuilding that they have to do, and dealing with people who are dealing with very sensitive issues, he's got to recruit, he's got to bring people in, there's got to be a transition, and so part of the delay, the perceived delay, is not as scintillating as a political strategy, but as boring as we got to staff up, and this is taking some time.
Well, to Donna's point, you have so many people that left who have institutional knowledge, who know how to do the job. You literally just don't have the bodies in those offices.
Exactly.
Well, and I do worry, to General Holder's point, that if the entire positioning of Democrats is wait for the Mueller report, and it either isn't revealed or doesn't turn up anything, that there are other aspects of the president's behavior now with respect maybe to his inauguration committee, to the Cohen investigation, to the Trump organization that raise serious concerns that responsibly require investigation and inquiry. And if you basically set that aside and say, you know, you look at the Cohen investigation and there are misdemeanor crimes alleged by maybe the President of the United States, and you set those aside because they haven't risen to, you know, some innocuous standard of impeachment, what does that say to the next president? What's the next standard? Are there another set of misdemeanor crimes that a president can commit that don't require investigation? And I worry about giving away the store because you've made a decision that for political or other reasons, you're going to wait until the Mueller report is done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe we'll come back to this question, and especially the Mueller report, with some of the student questions. The third initial topic I wanted to cover from your initial statements has to do with this idea of the House getting something done, right? And if they don't get anything done, and this was part of what you were saying, Greg, and by the way, you all have so many honorific titles that I'm just going to go with first names right now, because this is, okay? All right, everybody, apologies to... I don't have any. All right. Greg, I mean, that was part of what you were saying. In other words, and Steve, you were saying that as well. I mean, if they don't kind of ante up, there's going to be this real feeling in 2020 that nothing's being done. If all they're doing is over investigation, it's just going to feel empty, right? But you know, how do you get something done? I mean, the House could pass as many bills as they want. That ain't going to help. It's not going to get anything done. So how do you get past that kind of problem right there? Do you want to kick us off, Greg?
Sure. I think there are certain policies that I think we could find common ground on. So infrastructure, I think, that seems to be a no-brainer.
Well, that was a Trump campaign pledge, right?
Exactly. Now, exactly what that common ground is another question. Well, you know, we just blew a hole through the deficit. You know, let's just keep going. But I think part of the problem is that, you know, Democrats can state their case about if the electorate was to return the Democratic Party, say, to unified control in 2020, what would they do with it, right? And so some of the meat and potatoes issues that you mentioned, I think those are the kinds of things I think Democrats can do now. And basically, H.R. 1 has gotten a lot of press. I mean, I don't recall another piece of legislation like that in a period of divided government getting as much attention as that did. And so I think that's part of what I think Democrats should do. Try to find common ground with Republicans. Like when I said that I think Republicans are more and more going to start to kick into self-preservation mode, they also want to say, look, we can be a responsible governing party. And I do think there are, even though we have extreme polarization now, parties and party leaders fight like cats and dogs. I do think, especially within Congress, there is this loyalty to the institution, and they value the democratic process, and that some of what should happen in the next 2 years is rebuilding faith in democratic institutions. And even though it's going to be really hard to find policies that appeal to broad segments, while there may be this temptation to appeal to the bases of the parties, that I think that that's something that both Republicans and Democrats can agree on.
But I mean, the first issue you talked about was health care, right? I mean, that as being the most important issue. I mean, how are we going to get health care?
I didn't mention healthcare.
You didn't mention healthcare? Okay, no, that was Steve then.
I think one of the ways that you can get to it where you might be able to find support across the line might be around prescription drug pricing.
Right. Sure.
I think that there are Republicans and Democrats, and clearly the electorate wants something along there. And so prescription drug prices on transportation and infrastructure. I remember when after TARP and we were passing other legislation to shore up the economy, that all of the Republicans and all the Democrats on the committee sent a letter to President Obama saying, we want you to do something big on infrastructure. So I do think that there are ways to do that. And you'll have the battles between urban and rural communities about what the priorities are, but those things are possible.
I would just add, look, everybody wants infrastructure. I don't think we met a Republican or a Democrat in the House of Representatives or the Senate who was against infrastructure. The fault line is who's going to pay for it and how do we pay for it? And there's only one way to pay for it. You've got to increase the gas tax. And that becomes toxic for some people. Now, here's my fantasy theory. Donald Trump cannot get reelected president just with his base. That 40% is not a path to winning the Electoral College. He's got to bring back some of those voters who were with him in 2016, left him in 2018. The way he does that, I think, is through infrastructure, reducing prescription drug prices, maybe a big opioid bill. If he were to say, I support increasing the gas tax by a penny, the last time the gas tax was increased was in 1994. He gives his Republicans cover. I mean, you'd be more of an expert on this, but if Donald Trump stood up and said, I support increasing the gas tax by 1 cent in order to generate trillions of dollars of new revenues to rebuild our bridges, our tunnels, to broadband, all of those important things, I think he actually enhances his path to being reelected, something that might be unviable for many. But I think that's the political strategy that helps get him reelected, and it's something that most Democrats would support.
It's interesting. In France, it caused this huge movement called the Yellow Vest movement, which has completely disrupted Macron's government. That was the gas tax. So it's a tricky issue.
But you have to go back down to the basics. When you look at what happened in 2018, with the Republicans that left, the majority of them were more moderate. There were the moderates who lost to a conservative who should never be running in a swing district. But you also lost a lot of moderate Democrats in primaries, or those who sought not to re-election. So you have extremes in the House, which are very vocal, and you see it with the Progressive Caucus in the Senate. In the House Democratic Party, and you see it with the Freedom Caucus with the Republicans, who proved that made life very difficult for any Republican leadership. Then you add to that compromising to some issues will really fracture. And on top of that, you have a presidential race with a primary right now on the Democratic field. When you talk about health care, it was brought up that perhaps one way to deal with it is to get rid of private insurance. While Medicaid for all may rate in the high 60s, getting rid of private insurance it's in the teens as a solution. So you see a lot of extremes within each party on how to address any potential problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you want to jump in, Eric, with this one?
No.
No? Okay. All right. No, I saw you were nodding in a way.
I'm just agreeing.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. All right. This is upbeat, actually. I mean, this is more upbeat. I mean, no, it sounds as you're suggesting that there are some ways of achieving something.
I mean, would Republicans support a rise in the gas tax? Is that something?
I don't think that would happen.
No?
Not right now.
Even a penny?
Even a penny. I just don't think that's where. I don't think the Freedom Caucus, which would really push most of the House right now, would go for it. But on an up note, I think the good thing is that you have all of us who are pretty experienced, and we still remain hopeful that things can happen.
Mm-hmm. You were going to jump in, Steve, on the gas tax? No. Okay.
No,
all right.
I'm
So the other thing,
general.
To everybody, a penny is probably not enough, but we won't talk about that.
Okay. All right. So the other areas I wanted to cover before we open up, and we're going to have mics that'll float, or do we have standing mics? What do we got? We'll have floating mics in about 5 minutes. Was actually the other actors, the other players at the table here. So the senators, the Senate. How is the Senate changing in this moment with this with the House? Democratic House, and also President Trump himself. So we just saw, for instance, that Mitch McConnell came out saying that you do not call a state of emergency, right? Was that an effect, do you think, of the mixed government? And are we seeing change in? Do we expect a change in the behavior of the Republicans in the Senate, basically, as a result of this? You want to start us off, Susan?
Sure.
And then go
Well,
down?
I think calling in a state of emergency, 12 Republican senators are now on board saying no go. Mitch McConnell is as old school as they get. If he doesn't have the votes, he's going to tell you not to go forward. That's the way he is. The other thing that I think put shockwaves through the White House was when on the vote to open the government, or end the shutdown, I should say, there were more yes votes for the Democrats' plan than the Republicans' plan. And that was a really frightening thought to this White House, meaning they were just so out of touch of where the party's going. I think what underlines a little bit of this newfound freedom, whether it's on foreign affairs in Afghanistan or at home, is the fear of the Mueller report, what may happen. No one knows what's going to happen, but we've seen indictment after indictment. We see other investigations coming out, and Republicans just don't know what to expect, and they're starting to get nervous. So they're going to maybe speak up where they have a little bit of room. But it's not in the, I wish I could say it was in the interest of good governance. It's in the interest of self-preservation.
So, but this would be a kind of a combined effect of the House turning Democrat and the kind of not knowing what's going to happen with the Mueller report, right? Combining those two. But the second one seems more important to you somehow.
Well, I'm a political operative, so here's that's what I look at, what incentivizes movement on the polls, etc. And I'm looking at this, the Senate's in pretty good shape, but it's not going into the same math as it is for Republicans as it was in 2018. It's a little harder this year. There may be a few upsets, so you see some purple state Republicans being able to put down a gauntlet and say, hey, I can't go that far. And they are also worried about primaries. I mean, I think that's what Mitch McConnell is afraid of, actually. And maybe we see him potentially not run because of that. But at the end of the day, the Mueller thing is what leaves them the most unsteady, because they know that they can't trust what the president says. And it just seems like, I doubt it'll go to no. It doesn't seem like it's going to lead to no indictments. I don't think we're going to see it be that closed.
So, Senate changes and presidential changes. Greg, what do you think?
I think a lot of it depends on, like I said, whether the electorate is in the mood for more correction. I think if you look at the Senate electoral geography for 2018, the Republicans should have walked to a supermajority, where the Democrats won in states where they just should not have won in 2018. And the only reason I think that happened was because Donald Trump was president. The electoral geography for 2020 is still, in the Senate, is favorable toward Republicans, but I can't see how you would be a Republican senator who would not look at 2018 and think, that could happen again, and it could be a lot worse for us. A lot of it depends on who's at the top of the Democratic ticket, but I think this. I don't think self-preservation is that cynical. I think that the framers of the Constitution knew that there's an accountability mechanism that they built in with re-election, and so it's not such a bad thing when members of Congress go into self-preservation mode. Maybe that could lead to very bad outcomes collectively, but at the same time, if you don't have that kind of accountability, then democracy doesn't really work.
And so, how do you think it's going to change President Trump's State of the Union address? So I just, not change, but I mean, how is it going to affect kind of that and what comes after? And I just read in the New York Times today, Steve, that you want the end of the State of the Union. Is that right?
The State of the Union is obsolete. It's ought not be done. Those of you, and I'm sure you deal with this in your class, the Constitution requires that the President of the United States from time to time submit a report to the Congress on the State of the Union. Washington showed up, Adams showed up, Thomas Jefferson said that has the look of monarchy, giving a speech to Congress. So he stopped it, and no president did it until Woodrow Wilson. And the tradition of presidents appearing has been intact since Woodrow Wilson. It is poll tested. It is focus group. Donna will tell you that about 5 minutes before the president arrives, every member of Congress gets the speech. They're going through with yellow highlighters because they're staying ahead of the president because they want to figure out what soundbite that they're going to deliver to the cameras in Statuary Hall. It is a long commercial, a very long commercial. and like most commercials for a product that doesn't always deliver. So I think what I do think we should have is the equivalent of Prime Minister's question time in the United States Congress. Wouldn't that be fun, where the president has to show up and answer a bunch of questions from members of Congress? That would not only be entertaining, but I think it would serve a purpose called spontaneity.
Donna, what do you think about about all this?
Yeah, I don't want to do the State of the Union, but I don't want to do that other stuff. It's really not clear what to expect tonight. I mean, we will get the Donald Trump who reads from the teleprompter. He will probably mostly stay on message and every line of that speech. And then there's tomorrow. And we don't know what tomorrow will hold. And it is likely to be just like we've seen in other instances where he's on the teleprompter, the message sounds like, you can live with it, and then the next day he undercuts every single thing that he said the night before. And so I think that's what I expect, and I don't know why any of us would expect any different.
Can I do a very quick addendum to that? Here's what to watch tonight. Here's what you should watch. There are 33 Republicans in districts where Donald Trump is underperforming. Watch whether they stand or sit when he says stuff, because that will give you an indication of how nervous they are about their next elections.
Susan, you want in?
I think we're going to see Donald Trump present his reality, whether it is within everyone else's, I'm not sure. But what I'm most interested in seeing is the response. Last year, you saw a real moderate Democrat give the response from Kentucky. Now we see Stacey Abrams, who has kind of set the world on fire with embracing the progressive side of her party, and she's giving the response. And I am just curious to see, what the president's Twitter account looks like. My guess is it'll be pretty quiet, actually, or attacking someone else. But I think it'll be very interesting to see how her response is welcomed, not among the Democratic primary presidential contenders or the insiders, but rather on the response from the general public.
Good. And there is an after show, so we'll get to see all three of them maybe
Well,
tonight.
it's more than all three. I mean, Bernie Sanders is also giving a response.
Oh, okay.
I mean, you talk about
right.
tone deaf. This guy, I'm serious. I mean, you've got an African-American woman who's going to be giving the response. You have Javier Becerra, who's going to be giving a response in Spanish. And then Bernie is giving something.
You have Oprah and Beto, too.
They're doing something?
They're doing something together in Times Square.
Oh, really?
Well, there you go.
Tonight, afterwards?
All right.
Interesting. All right.
I didn't know that.
So,
I'm just saying.
so we have a mic, and we'd love to hear questions from students. I have a question right here in the front row, I see. Would you introduce yourself and then ask
Good
her?
evening. My name is Kiana Dixon. I'm an alum of the Millman School of Public Health and Columbia College. Thank you all for being here. I grew up in your former district, Congresswoman Edwards. I have two questions. My first is for Attorney General Holder, and the other one is just for the panel. The first question is, will you be running for president? And the second one is, should there be term limits in Congress?
Let me answer the first one. The second one. I actually have a split view of that. I think that senatorial terms, senators should be term limited, three terms. I also think that Supreme Court justices should serve maybe 3 senatorial terms, 18 years. Life expectancy has grown. Having one person in an unelected position for 30 years potentially, I think that's too much power infused in one person. So I would put term limits on senators and Supreme Court justices. The House of Representatives, by contrast, you come out every 2 years. And it seems to me that if you have the ability every 2 years to get reelected, you're really in touch with your constituents. As to your first question, I don't know yet.
Next question. Row in the fourth row there. Can you? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Corey Cooper, and I'm in the JD program here at the law school. So I'm wondering, and this is a question for the whole panel, is it too early to hope that this government is at all strategizing about how to repair crumbling international relations due to the publicly ineffectual and disorganized governance that we've seen on display? You can look at Nikki Haley quitting halfway through her job as UN ambassador, children being kidnapped from their mothers purposely and then lost to the system on the border, and then even obviously Trump exchanging threats with Kim Jong-un. All of these things are very public in the news, but what I'm not hearing so much is, what can be done with so many diplomatic positions yet unfilled to start to repair these relations, to get back any stabilization in these different regions. Thank you.
Donna, do you want to start?
Or Donna?
Well, one of the things, and Susan, your remarks earlier, this week, last week, there was a rebuke of the president on Syria. Speaking of splits with the Republican Party, but it was a pretty strong rebuke of the president, and I think that increasingly, particularly if the president continues the sort of anti-NATO thing, you will see the same thing coming out of the Congress as a way to send a message to our friends and allies around the world about where the United States really is, irrespective of who's sitting in the White House right now. So, I do believe that. We had a time where we thought that there were adults around the president that was, constraining his worst instincts. I think that is increasingly less true.
Go ahead, Steve.
This worries me a lot, and it should worry you as well. Secretary Kerry, a few days ago, was telling a group of us that Putin is going around the world saying this: the United States is in inexorable decline. The Western liberal order is dying and decaying. His model is the only model that is working. And foreign leaders are beginning to buy into that. China is all over Africa doing international development with NGOs, providing health services, environmental services in villages all across Africa. We are, if the president gets his way, we will pull out of Syria and put troops perhaps in Venezuela. If that's not a volatile foreign policy, I don't know what is. We have gone, whether you like a foreign policy or not, fundamentally a foreign policy must have three things. It must be consistent, it must be credible, and it must be cohesive. And we have a foreign policy in an international order right now that is not consistent, that is not cohesive, and it is not credible. Now, if it were just a matter of, do we build another bridge, if it was just a matter of infrastructure, we can get through that. But it's hard to repair the damage that is being done to the world in a foreign policy that is in disarray and as supportive of authoritarian regimes as the one we have now. I think it's going to take a long time to repair the damage that has been done. Luckily, and I'll agree with Donna on this, this is the one issue that I do think is bringing together Democrats and Republicans. I think you're absolutely right. This is a line that neither Democrats or Republicans want to cross, and they have put restraints on President Trump. It's just that those restraints may not be as effective as we want them to be.
Susan, you're nodding.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think we saw two moments. One was pretty scary earlier this week, or yesterday, I guess it was, where we learned that the president doesn't like to hear from his advisors things that he disagrees with, which is awful scary. We already know he doesn't read the intel reports. But on the flip side of that, last week we also saw his representatives to the Intel Committee speak truth to power about where we are on foreign policy, which tells me that public servants like the three of you put our country first, and that's what they were doing. I will say, though, one of the scariest days for me was when Roger Stone was indicted, and the same day air traffic controllers did not show up, and it caused the shutdown of LaGuardia Airport. I never felt that we were so vulnerable as a country for outside influences, and we had a president not prepared to act. So I think that there's a lot of ups and downs in that feeling, but I do agree, we do unite as a country when it comes to foreign policy in the House and the Senate.
So I think there's, to this question, so we've been talking a lot about the short term, of what's going to happen over the next 2 years or so, but I think there's a longer game here where Congress as an institution may realize we have delegated too much authority to the executive on foreign policy, on other issues, and like they did in the Watergate era, Congress reasserted itself vis-a-vis the executive. And I think one long-term outcome that may come out of this is realizing that Congress as an institution needs to do more to constrain the executive, not just through oversight, but through statutory means in order to make sure that we have more balance of power at the federal level.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that there was such a movement towards kind of unbounded executive power in the late aughts, right? So many, and there was almost there's a lot of academic writing on the idea that the executive needed to be unbound in a way. It was controversial, but I mean, you hadn't heard it before, and you're not hearing it now. But there was that time when a lot of books were being written on that, and to a certain extent, we might be kind of suffering the consequences of that today. All right, let's take another question. Yes, in the front row. In the second row. I'm sorry. Do you have a mic? Got two questions right there. Let's go one and then next.
Thank you. My name is Henry. I'm a freshman in the college, and I want to ask about what I see as one of the worst outcomes of the Trump presidency, and that is a growing distrust and disdain, not only for government, but for public service. And beyond just housing and urban development, where we've seen these kind of systematic retirings across all of our institutions, the EPA, the Department of State, as documented by Ronan Farrow's most recent book, is rather terrifying empty offices. How can we re-incentivize, as Americans, not only as Democrats, but Republicans as well, and independents, how can we re-incentivize both a trust in government and re-incentivize public service?
Thanks for a great question. And just pass the mic down the other direction for the next question. I think maybe that one goes to you, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, my first conscious awareness of the presidency was the Kennedy administration. Bobby Kennedy, Attorney General, John Kennedy, President, and President Kennedy talked about the value of public service, how it was a laudable thing. You fast forward to 1980 and the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, and the problem is government, and that's I think in some ways a fundamentally different view. I think that it is up to our leaders to do what Kennedy did and to speak to the people about the need for public service, to make people aware of their capacity to affect change, not only in public service, but as citizens. People underestimate their power as ordinary citizens. Yes, you should certainly vote, but you think about what an aroused population did when there was the thought of repealing the Affordable Care Act. People went to the offices of their senators, the offices of their congressmen, and really, I think, moved them away from that which they were intending to do. You think about the power of women marching the day after the inauguration and all that meant. We have a lot of power as citizens. I think there is the need for the revaluing of public service. A lot of it is, and this sounds a little trite, is messaging, but there is that. There is that need to tell people exactly that. And I think that's one of the duties that our leaders have, and that they've been woefully inadequate in conveying in recent years.
Yeah, so and I agree with all that, but you got to say that Trump has motivated more public service and more women running and more minorities women running than any kind of public messaging, right?
Well, I think in some ways that is the silver lining of the Trump administration, and that is it's messaging in a different
Inverse.
Yeah, it's negative messaging, I suppose, but it's had a positive impact. People getting more involved. And I think that I still speak to my friends in the Justice Department, where morale is extremely low, but people are holding on. People are staying. We're losing people at DOJ and at other places at rates that are probably in excess of what is normal. But I don't think we should underestimate what a new president in 2020, with a focus on the value of public service, with a belief in the utility of government, how that whole narrative can be changed, I think, relatively quickly.
Steve, you want to?
I agree. I think there's another dimension to this. That's very much top down. It's what jobs can we fill, what positions, what public engagement. But man, I mean, why would anybody think that public service is worth it when they don't believe that their vote even counts? If you can't even vote, if you're standing on a line in Ohio for 10 hours to cast your vote for president, why in the world would you believe that you can have a voice at the higher levels of government? And nobody knows more about that than Eric Holder, by the way. And so I'm hopeful that one of the things that Democrats will do, and I just don't understand why more Republicans won't engage in this, is end voter suppression, make sure that the technologies are equal, that every vote counts, and that votes are not suppressed in an orchestrated and organized strategy to stop certain people of certain colors, of certain persuasions from casting their votes. When people think their vote matters, then maybe they'll be more confident about a career in public service.
Great, thanks so much. Yes, next question.
Hi. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm in the JD program at the law school, actually a student of Professor Harcourt's. My question is, I think there is a lot of discussion in the news and just generally about whether the Democrats should be devoting more of their energy and resources towards defeating Trump in 2020 or actually trying to impeach him right now or implement other accountability measures. And I was wondering, just to the panel at large, where you think that would be better spent.
Donna, you want to start us off?
I think you got to do all of it. But everybody can't do everything. And I think obviously we've talked a lot about oversight and the role of investigations, and that has to take place, and for accountability both to the citizens and to the institution. And making sure, I think among Democrats, can be a real test over this next 2 years to have a candidate that is deeply reflective of the party and the nation to be able to mount a significant and winning challenge against the president. And I don't think that we should assume that we won't have this president to run against. And then lastly, I think it's really important for us to be running for something. And so I know when I'm looking for a candidate, I want somebody who can win, and I want somebody who can really stand toe-to-toe with the president, not on his level sometimes, but making sure that a message gets across. And then I want somebody who has a vision for the future, about not just about how to unite the country, but how to get things done for ordinary people who don't have all day, every day to pay attention to what's going on in Washington.
Greg, you were agreeing.
So my concern about impeachment is that my sense is that voters don't like having choices taken away from them. And what impeachment is, in some senses, you're saying, voters, you made a really bad choice, and we're going to correct that choice for you. If you look at recall elections, you look at other attempts to remove politicians, especially executives, it's a lot harder than it seems like it should be. And my worry is that while I do think the president has committed impeachable offenses, I don't know that the country would be better off if he is actually removed from office. I don't think he will be impeached. I think he will resign before that happens. I think we'll get a repeat of Nixon. But I do worry that if this is pushed too far, that voters will reject this approach, and instead will say, well, let us make a choice in 2020 and decide whether or not we want to keep this individual as president. It's very hard to defeat an incumbent president, as you all know, but I don't think it's that hard to defeat an incumbent president whose approval rating is mired in the 30s.
Susan, you're nodding yes.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And one thing I told potential clients in 2016 was, you're not going to get elected if you tell people you made the wrong decision in voting for Obama to get them to come over to the Republican side. You're absolutely right. You never get anywhere telling someone they're wrong. You have to give a reason why they should no longer be there. But more importantly, to your point, Donna, you have to give them something to vote for. But on impeachment is tricky, and I just look at the timetable of it all, frankly, and we're sitting here in February, assuming I don't think that they would take any real votes until maybe April, late March. We're getting terribly close to the election cycle, and for everyone who talks about the Supreme Court and closeness and not filling a seat, I'm with you. I was really upset with Mitch McConnell on that. But I do think that there is some political turbulence that can happen and maybe spin this country, if you can believe it or not, worse out than it is right now.
Steve.
Just some raw meat politics. There have only been 3 occasions in our history when the president's party has won seats in a midterm election. The first was in FDR's first midterm, when people were still angry at Hoover, and it was the Great Depression. Roosevelt and the Democrats picked up seats. On the other side was George W. Bush. The Republicans picked up seats in 2002 because of 9/11. You know what the third one was? Bill Clinton. You know why Bill Clinton won seats in his midterm election? Because people were really pissed off at the Republicans over impeachment. Because they didn't think the guy should have been impeached, and they took it out on Republicans. I think if there are impeachable offenses, let's have at it. But unless there are clear impeachable offenses, if we do that, we take great political risk. Second, final point on this. How many of you have ever heard of Brooklyn, New York? Raise your hands. How many of you have ever heard of Brooklyn, Iowa? There's a Brooklyn, Iowa. Brooklyn, Iowa, General, was represented by a Republican member in the House of Representatives. The Democrats won that district. We won Brooklyn, Iowa. It was earth-shattering. The candidate, the Democrat who won in Brooklyn, Iowa, you know what she said? She never talked about impeachment. She talked about soy. She talked about levies. She talked about prescription drug prices. And she said had she talked about impeachment, she wouldn't have won. So we've got to exercise, Congress has to exercise its constitutional oversight responsibility, but it's also got to do those other things and not extend too far.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, that I think this has to be a careful process. We have never removed a president. You know, we've impeached a couple, but we have never removed a president. No one's ever been convicted. However, this president's different in fundamental ways. And if the proof is there, we have got to have faith in our systems. And if the proof is there, it's incumbent upon Congress to do the things that they are constitutionally charged with doing. An impeachment in the House, a potential conviction in the Senate. Though I think conviction in the Senate is really going to be a difficult thing. You need about, 18, 20 Republican senators to come across, and with the president's approval rating as high as it is on the Republican side, that's a difficult thing. But political considerations aside, if the determination is made that there are impeachable offenses, as somebody was saying earlier, I think to not follow that constitutional duty that the House would have, that the Senate would have, potentially emboldens a successor president to think, well, this is what I can get away with. And that is not, that's not good for the country over the long term.
All right, I think we got time for just one more question. So, Kat in the front.
Hi, my name is Kat, and I'm a sophomore at Columbia College. My question is, I guess I'm a little inspired by our seminar, my seminar with Professor Harcourt. What is your interpretations of candidates on both sides of the aisle adopting the phrase that they are the voice of the people, and how is that deepening our divide in partisan politics today?
So the question of kind of populism as something that's being used increasingly, possibly, on some sides, the other. Susan, you want to start us off?
I think the part of the problem is who you're speaking of. I mean, we are so polarized that when you say the voice of the people, which people? Which people, which side are you talking about? Because as I said earlier, we've gone from differing on opinions and policies to just being disagreeable against anyone from any side. So when you say voice of the people, is it an election that determines that? Is it a poll that determines it? And who's reading that poll, for example? So I think, unfortunately, right now we're so fractured that only under tremendous circumstances do we become we the people, and that melts away and maybe gets fixed, but I don't think it exists right now.
I'm going to give the last word to General Holder, but before I do, any final thoughts on this particular question of kind of the role of populist discourse in contemporary politics? Donna?
I think it's really tricky. I mean, as an African American member of Congress, I was always asked, well, you know, what do black people think about X or Y or Z? And I would always hold off on that, because then it suggests that somehow we're a monolith, that we don't have divergent thoughts even within a community. And so I think, you know, for those who are running for office now and talk about, you know, speaking for the people, I think it's important to be really careful about whom you're speaking and whether you're carrying their voice or whether you are their voice.
Any final thoughts? No? We're good? We're good? All right. So this has been a spectacular conversation and a great, I don't want to say warm-up, but it's good. I'm gonna have this conversation in my head all night long as I listen to all of the different states of the union tonight. Before we move to the reception, and there is a reception, so I hope you'll join us and have some more questions for our speakers who will be there with us. I wanted to give the last word to General Holder.
And I see them taking the tops off of things over there, so I think that's where the food is. I first want to thank Professor Harcourt for doing his usual superb job. Thank you, Bernard. And I also want to give great thanks to a wonderful panel. This was, I think, a rich conversation filled with a lot of experience, and I think that you should keep that in mind. The opinions that you heard, the observations that were made, have been made by people who have been in the trenches. And I think in a lot of ways that is really the value here, in addition to the academic perspective that we had as well. So I think it's been a nice combination. You know, it'll be interesting to see what happens with regard to the issues that we have discussed today over these next couple of years. We focus on those first 30 days. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 2 years, whether the trends that we have talked about, the possibilities that we have discussed actually turn out that way, or do we go in a fundamentally different way? Every day I tell myself, well, this couldn't possibly happen with regard to the Trump administration, and every day it does. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the executive branch, what happens in the legislative branch. My hope will be that you all will be studying what's going on, that you will be participating in what is going on. And as I said before, don't ever forget the ability that you have, the capacity that you have, and the responsibility that you have as citizens, not only to monitor, but to participate in the dialogue and in the action of government. There is a huge amount of untapped power out there that I hope you all will tap into and lead others to engage in political discourse and in political action. That's what this initiative of ours is really, all about, to expose people like yourselves to wonderful people like this, and then for you to act upon it. Not simply to study, to be, to observe, but to use this as a spur to real and concrete action. So, leave here inspired by these great people and determined to affect positive change. It's possible.
Thank you, and thank you all.